Good morning. It's Wednesday. It is 10 a.m. and it is time for gardening on the Gulf Coast. We'd like to welcome you. This is a program presented by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and the horticulture agents that make up the Gulf Coast region. Some housekeeping. This program will be recorded. Uh, and it is up and running already, so that is great. Please make sure you mute your mics. And if you've been with us before, you guys know that. You guys are all doing a great job. Also, please keep the cameras off. It helps with our the bandwidth and things to move along much more smoothly. As you can see, this is our next to last presentation for the month of December and for the 2020 year. So we have, it's been a lot of fun. We've been providing a lot of information. We hope you've enjoyed it, and it is not going away. We will be back in 2021 also. So today we are going to have Boone Holladay, who is our hort agent in Fort Bend County. He will be talking about winter bulb care and division. And then next week, it will close out on the 16th with horticulture myths and mystics. And this will be brought to you by Stephen Brugerhoff, who is the hort agent in Brazoria County. So without any further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to Mr. Boone Holladay from Fort Bend County. Boone, it is all yours.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. I do appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody joining in today. We're going to have a fun program, a little different than we've done in the past. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I had to close my door, having a conversation in the hallway. Well, my name is Boone Holladay. I'm the county extension agent for horticulture here in Fort Bend County. And we do a lot of things as horticulturists in the county, covering all aspects of the green industry, everything from St. Augustine grass to oak trees, to fruits, vegetables, herbs, you name it. But in my particular situation, I really geek out on bulbs. I've always been a fan of bulbs, even before my days in horticulture, of being a young teenager and being forced to do yard work on the weekends by my parents. I would have much rather been out riding bicycles or skateboards, but they mandated that I spent quite a number of hours against my will in the yard. And some of the things that I noticed were bulbs and the seasonality of these plants that were not there. You couldn't see anything, and then after a rain or seasonal weather change, these bulbs would pop up out of the ground and flower. And so I was pretty intrigued, and that was something of 30 years ago. And I've been studying and planting bulbs ever since. I'm not claiming to be an expert by any means, but I am a student in progress, and I tend to, measure myself up with other people talking about bulbs, with the number of bulbs or different types of plants that we've successfully killed. And that is a reality in horticulture, is that a lot of times when we are practicing and trialing new plants, we find a lot of those plants just don't work for us here in Southeast Texas. The one thing that's important for us to understand is that we have a We have a tough weather pattern here in Texas, South Texas, along the Gulf Coast, where we have a roller coaster of weather, particularly our winters. Can be 80 degrees one week and then down in the 30s the next week. It can be sunny and very dry. As we've seen here in the last couple of months, we went through a little drought and then all of a sudden we're in a swamp. And so you take all those variables of hot and cold and wet and dry and up and down. It means that a lot of plants for us just have a very hard time establishing because either they're not hardy here or we end up drowning them on accident when we do have a lot of heavy rain. We do have heavy disease pressure because of our high humidity and warm temperatures. And we do have a lot of insect pressure because of our long growing season. Our lack of freezing weather and frosts compounds the amount of pressure that we have from all of these natural components. So what we have to do is we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to grow the plants that really, really, really want to grow here, and try to stay away from ones that are marginal and weak, so that we get the maximum enjoyment out of growing them. And this is in particular, we're going to talk about bulbs. So let's do a little quick dive into bulbs. I brought some gloves in here today, and I brought some little plants. Let's see. All right, we'll start with this little guy right here. And thanks to our demonstration gardens out back, I had some samples of some different plants. So this right here is a young Louisiana iris, okay? And we can see this root right here. The plant growing tip is here. This right here is a rhizome. This is a modified stem that grows laterally underneath the ground surface. If this was above the ground surface, we would call this a stolon. But since it's below the ground, we call it a rhizome. And this is a modified stem that continues to move around and spread the plant out in different directions. Other plants that are similar to this, being rhizomes, would be ginger, turmeric, and canna lilies that grow in this fashion. So that's one here. My office is going to be a mess after this, but this is what we do in horticulture. We make messes. All right, so this next one here, this plant right here is called Crocosmia, and this is a corm. Okay, and a corm is different. I don't know if you can see that on there. Okay, corm is different from a bulb in that it's a starchy, solid body. This is a modified stem that's a solid, starchy body. So if I cut this open, I'm not going to see much in there except something that looks like a hazelnut or acorn in nature. And it reproduces by a base here with the roots that come off here, and then it has a tunic, which is this fibery cover on the edge of the bulb. Probably more common plant in this area is going to be Gladiolus. All gladioluses or gladioli are corms. Okay, and it's a modified stem, but again, this is not a bulb. All these plants are what we call geophytes, and basically they're, instead of like a tree that has a stem or a trunk that's above ground, its trunk or stem is in the ground. Geophyte means earth loving or ground loving. And this is another one here. This is a daylily, and this one's kind of an anomaly here. If we've dug up daylilies before, we'll see this big crown here at the bottom with the roots coming off of it. And then as you move out away from that, we see these big swollen roots. And this one here is called a tuberous root. And what it does is it moves out, and then as these tuberous roots mature, they develop eyes on them, okay, or propagule points, where it sprouts up another plant. And so if you've grown daylilies, you know that this is, can be potentially a weed if we just let it grow out, because it keeps popping out further and further away from the plant that you started with. So there is some amount of care seasonally to keep these maintained, keep them from taking over and becoming a solid ground cover in your bed. And then one that I don't have today is the actual tuber, which would be more of like your Irish potatoes, etc., that will propagate as they develop out from the roots, and then we get more of the tubers growing on the roots with propagules on them. But I don't have an example of one of those today. I do have a couple bulbs here, okay? And this is a multiplying onion here. And as I see this little cluster here, we'll find 3 small bulbs in this little cluster here. And what this does is this starts from one plant, and the whole plant itself actually divides. It cracks through the center, and it develops into multiple plants. In this case, 4 actually, from one plant. So there's the original plant we started with is now kind of broke down and has turned into several small plants. And I'll get into that further when we talk about how these divide on different types of plants. But that's a true bulb on there. And we've got this one here. Okay, and I've got this guy right here. This is a giant rain lily or prairie rain lily. And this is quite a large bulb here, but this is a true bulb when we say the word bulb. When we have all these other plants that I've just discussed that are geophytes, that have modified stems that grow underground, but they are not actually true bulbs. And so I'll go over the things that define what a bulb is. Now, if you have problems with me mutilating a bulb, then you need to tune out, because I'm gonna cut this thing open. So I just cut the neck off here, the foliage, just for reference, and we're gonna go over a couple of things on this particular plant. To define a bulb, we have leaf scales, which if you've cut an onion in half, it's probably the best if it's particularly a red onion, to see those gray and pink striations. But if we look at this up close, we see these little striations in here, and each of these little layers going up is a leaf. And the leaves on the outside have probably already matured out to become a full. And then the ones towards the center in here, this is called the meristem, or the growth tip area. These are going to be our primordia, or basically our future leaves. This is going to get growing out the center, and typically the flower buds will grow right here from this meristem tissue as well. So you've got to have these leaf scales. Now, I mentioned on the corms is that you don't have these real defined leaf scales inside of here. It looks more just like solid material, like if you cut an acorn in half. So that's one thing that's going to help define a bulb. The other thing that's called a tunic, and a tunic is this outside layer of tissue, and I'll peel off just a little piece of it. This right here is on the outside, and this is as those leaves mature. This would be similar to what we would call secondary phloem or exterior bark on a tree. The exterior bark on a tree is not living. What's living is underneath that, the phloem. And as that phloem gets older, it becomes chunky. And what it does is it serves its purpose in defending the plant from any type of pest, whether it's animal, disease, insect, etc. And so this tunic layer on here is very important, that stays on there, that we don't think, oh, look at that layer on there, it's gross. I'm trying to peel it off. Leave it on there because it has a significant purpose on protecting the bulb. The next part of the bulb here is going to be this area right at the bottom, and this is called the basal plate. Basal plate, B-A-S-A-L, okay? And this little plate, it's a little disc that grows on the bottom side of the bulb. Let me get another one here. Okay, so I just cut right here. I got roots, basal plate, and over here I've got all this leaf scale, some tunic on here, and then all this leaf tissue, okay? But since I just cut that off, this part, all this part of the plant right here now is dead. It will not grow back. It can't grow back because it doesn't have the reproductive tissue on it, the meristematic tissue that comes right from the growth tip here on the basal plate and the roots. So without that bottom, all this is junk, okay? Now I just mutilated that, but if you've dug large bulbs before, you've probably done this. See this big guy here? Okay, this is a Hymenocallus, or it's a white swamp lily or southern swamp lily. Beautiful summer growing bulb here for the south, but the bulbs grow real deep in the ground and they can be quite large, and so digging them can be a chore. You really need to dig way down deep underneath the whole cluster, dig up the whole cluster, separate it as needed. But if you start trying to peel off pieces of it, this is what you get right here. This is very common. I've done this 1,000 times. And so now there's no basal plate. All that is just the bottom of the leaf scales. And so this whole tunic, the stem, all the leaves is now trash. This can go to the compost pile or wherever you want to do with it. It's never going to grow back again. It just won't. So that's what's very important. And I just wanted to really spend some time going into this basal plate. It's a corky disc. If we turn the bulb upside down and see at the bottom here, it's a ring. It can be some bulbs like some old heirloom Hippeastrum or the Dutch Amaryllis. If you've had those for years and years, a lot of times those basal plates will be very thick depth-wise here, that would allude to the fact that that is actually a very old bulb that has not broken up to the point that has impacted that basal plate. Whew. All right, so I've got a pretty good mess here on my table, but I'm going to
Hey,
go into seasonality.
hey, Boone, you want to answer a quick question first?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is from Suma, and her question is, so rain lilies also have seeds. Will they grow from seeds then?
Well, that's a very good question, Suma. Um, and this one right here is um, is a rain lily. This is the big white giant prairie lily, and I think I might have some other ones in my little basket there. This particular bulb, you see how big it is here. When I dig these up, they're solitary. Okay, so that means you're not going to find a big cluster of these particular rain lilies in a tight cluster, and and that is because they only reproduce reliably from seeds. Um, a lot of bulbs produce by offsets, and so the cluster will divide itself, break apart, and then we get this multiplication of increase in numbers. But some particular plants, um, they don't do that, and this is one of those. This one really needs to be able to flower, uh, set seed, let the seed heads mature, and then harvest those seeds and either sprinkle them around the garden, or you can propagate the seeds in a tray of moist sand or perlite or vermiculite. And then once those young seedlings germinate and grow, you could start potting those up, growing them out a little bit, and then placing them out in the garden. Um, so that that's that. But there's a full variation of different plants, and Paul's going to be putting some resources to some books that I would recommend on bulbs for the South, and it will designate which ones are reliable self-propagators that divide very quickly, or which ones would need to be nurtured through the seed development process to be able to harvest those seeds and help it reproduce that way. Um, One of those is Bulbs for the South, and that is Scott Ogden. Another one of those is Thad Howard, and I believe this is Bulbs for Warm Climates. And then there are several books from Greg Grant, Bill Welch, and from Chris Weisinger on the topics of bulbs for the South. So, uh, if you need to dive into which ones grow better in different ways or methods, those books will help you. One question I see here on the basal plate is this is the basal plate with the roots on it. Yes, if I plant this in the ground, this will eventually reproduce. Now, what it has to do, it has to start healing and regrowing from the center of the basal plate. Usually what you would see on here is a bunch of very small little growth tips starting to develop, and then a cluster of quite a few small plants. And then within 2 or 3 years, you would have a cluster of young bulbs that you could either leave in the cluster, or you could dig up and separate out and into individual clumps from that point on. So yes, if you've got the basal plate, then you'll be in good shape if you got it. Seasonality and types of bulbs is some stuff I'd like to go over here real quick. I mentioned the types of bulbs that grow well for us, and this is challenging because as gardeners, we get a lot of catalogs. There's a lot of things online, and we see some amazing looking bulbs, lilies, um, pineapple lilies, tulips, ranunculus, anemones, etc. That just for us just don't work for us. They're not hardy. They don't like our warm winters. They don't like our humidity, and so it's difficult for us. Not to say that there's not things in catalogs that we can continue to trial and maybe have success with, but a lot of stuff that's there just doesn't grow well for us year after year, and that would be perennializing such bulbs. So I wouldn't discourage you from growing bulbs annually, because if you purchase bulbs like a tulip from a reputable nursery or catalog, they're going to be pre-chilled. They're going to be growth matured, and so when you get those plants and you plant them here, you've got a pretty good chance is that year one you're going to get what you want from it. You're going to get it. Foliage is going to rise. You're going to have a good floral display. But after that, it's a big question mark. And a lot of these bulbs from catalogs, that's it. That's all you're going to get out of it. And then the results that you get from it are going to continually diminish year after year. So it's looking at what we call hardy bulbs, and that's just a very generic term for plants that will perennialize for us here, that can handle our weather, and that will not only persist but multiply year after year, multiplying our enjoyment from those plants. You've probably heard the term heirloom bulbs, and basically this is a term that alludes to bulbs that were brought here from early settlers, and they were passed along plants. These were plants that were brought from different countries, different cultures, and we're reproducing the same genetics that they came here. So, for instance, the hardy Johnson's hardy Amaryllis, Hippeastrum johnsonii, was a plant that originated in South America. It made its way through explorers back to Europe, through Germany, and then the United States, and then moved across the country as the settlers headed west. So that's what when we say heirloom, and we tend to recommend those because they're proven. They've been here for hundreds of years. A lot of times, we're exploring old abandoned home sites. For us, it's going to be Central Texas, Northeast Texas, going into Louisiana, some old ghost towns in Oklahoma and Arkansas. Houses are gone. The old brick chimney is still there. The foundation blocks are there, and the bulbs are still there. Maybe there's vines and trees growing over them, but those plants have persisted years without any human care, and so those tend to be ones that we recommend because they've proven themselves through time. But just the concept of hardy bulbs, the hardy bulb could be an heirloom, or it could be a newer introduction. Got a question in here about tiger lilies. Okay, a lot of the lilies do pretty well for us, but they're going to be hit or miss. Sometimes, we've had success with certain varieties of lilies. Sometimes we just haven't. Okay, and that could be more due to the environmental situations that we've put them in, or that Mother Nature has brought to us. So a tiger lily, I'll just use that as my example here for Gene, is a pretty good plant most times. But if we get into a situation, one, where we get a lot of rainfall, then those bulbs may rot in the ground for us. Other situations is with winter. What they can do is we get these little summers that pop up in January for us, and sometimes February, where we have a week, maybe 2 weeks of unseasonably warm weather, and tiger lily, among a lot of other plants, more modern hybridized plants, they get tricked by that. Okay, they get a signal if they've got their chill hour requirements and it gets warm in January, they're thinking that it's March and they're going to start coming out of dormancy. And then a week later, we'll get a hard cold front or heavy frost, and that sets them back quite a bit. And if we do that repeated times to this plant, each time that happens, it loses energy, it loses carbohydrate storages, and it just loses vigor. And then gradually, they just peter out on you. Okay, so if everything works out just right, there's a lot of plants that are marginal that may do well, but with our weather situations, and I've been here in Fort Bend County for 8 years, and we've had 2 historic floods. We've had hottest temperatures, the longest droughts on record, in 5, 6, 7 years, and here in Fort Bend County. So we don't know what we're going to get weather-wise, and so some of these marginal bulbs, buyer beware that you're kind of rolling the dice on how well they're going to perform for us. Now, quick seasonality on bulbs is we've got cool season bulbs and we've got warm season bulbs. And so one that I showed you there was this Hymenocallus, or the southern swamp lily. It's a plant that has its foliage growing all summer, and it'll produce blooms during the warm season. And what we'll see with it up at the top up here is obvious freeze damage. Okay, so it is not one that can handle cold weather. Right. So I bring this up because this helps us in making our decisions of when we're going to try to divide these bulbs. Ultimately, that's what many of you have signed up for the class today, is learn about division. And we want to study seasonality because we want to divide those plants they at the best opportunity throughout the year for the plant. So if we take these plants now that are either dormant or going dormant because of the cool season, this would be a good time for us to dig those plants while they're down. So for that plant, Crinums, Hymenocallus, Dutch Amaryllis, which is your Hippeastrums, Belladonna Lily, which is your true Amaryllis, those plants that freeze and during cold weather, the foliage freezes, this is the time of year that we would want to dig those and divide those them garden. We don't need to store them. They don't need refrigeration or drying out in bags and in the house and so forth. We would just dig those plants, doing our best not to damage the bulbs, and then move them back into the ground. If we end up cutting the bulb or severing side of it, best thing to do with that is just set that out for a day or two to let it callus. And that's just, we want that wound that we create. A lot of times it's going to be white and sappy. We want that to become dry and hard on the surface before we put it back into the ground. And that's going to help us avoid bacterial infection on those plants, so that they don't incur a rotting once we get those into the ground. Other plants that are the cool season plants tend to be, our narcissus, daffodils, jonquils, etc., that are just starting to come up out of the ground right now. So if we think about their life cycle, they're going to start coming up, and then in midwinter and early spring, they're going to produce their floral show. And then the foliage is going to grow out during spring, and typically about March through May, the foliage starts to diminish. It starts yellowing, and then it gets crispy and brown. And at that point, that is the time that we want to dig those plants and divide them. And the same thing with them, as we can We can dig them, divide them, and then put them right back in the ground. We don't have to store them inside. All these hardy bulbs for us, they don't need our care as far as refrigeration or cold, dark storage, any of that stuff. Just divide them and get them back in the ground as soon as possible. Um, so, uh, Paul, I'm going to jump on a couple of these questions here real quick. Um, Amaryllis from Catherine. Yes, if we're not trying to divide the bulbs, if you don't have a large cluster and we're not trying to move those around the garden or give a cluster to a friend or a neighbor, leave all the hardy bulbs in the ground, because us just digging them and messing around with them is plant abuse. It really is just torture on the plant. We don't need to do it. Leave them there and let them thrive. The more we mess with the bulbs, the longer it takes for them to establish, and they're not going to bloom for you. Now, there's a disclaimer to that. Of some plants, particularly some of our narcissus, they can become clustered to the point where the flowering will minimize. So it may be a good idea every couple of years to dig those and to separate those clusters out to encourage them to have more room to spread out, and then we'll have a larger floral display from those. But by all means, and in most situations, if we're not dividing them on purpose, we leave those in the ground. Question on oxblood lilies. Oxblood lily is a beautiful small dark red amaryllis, and it's one of my favorites. It's a heavy reproducer. If you leave it in the same spot, you're just going to get more and more and more flowers there. But if you want to dig it and divide it every couple of years, probably a good idea to separate that out into smaller clusters. Same thing with the narcissus. Usually the foliage on the oxbloods starts to diminish in April. And as that starts to wilt down, you can dig those up, divide them, and then put them right back in the ground wherever you want them at. And it's by far the heaviest divider or self-propagator of all the plants that I've grown. It is a very vigorous plant. Now there's some other plants, Lycoris, which is your spider lilies. There's red, white, yellow, some bicolors. It's one that when we divide it, it tends to take 2 or 3 years to get reestablished before it's going to flower for you again. So that's one that is probably best just to plant it and just leave it alone, unless the cluster's gotten so big and out of hand that you need to dig it and divide it up into some smaller close clusters. But just know that when you dig it and move it somewhere, that it's going to sit there for a couple years before it gets established, before it flowers again.
Boone, there was another one above that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you that real quick.
Sure.
Jan asked, should you remove the foliage before replanting?
Very good question. When it gets to the point that the foliage is brown, I use examples for the winter bulbs come summertime. All your narcissus, daffodils, etc. When that foliage is completely crispy and brown and it's falling down the ground, and if you can grab it and just pull it and it comes loose, that's perfectly fine. Okay. But if you've got green leaves on the plant, there's no reason for you to cut those off. That's the solar panel for the plant. So if it has green on there, then it's photosynthesizing and it needs those leaves. And so all you're doing by removing those leaves is a disservice to the plant. Same thing with roots. A lot of times, we've got a lot of roots on there. Even if the roots are dry on the plant, I tend to leave them on there. Okay, you can just get if you're having to store the bulbs for a little while is get as much of the soil away from the root system as you can so that it'll dry. We don't want to store them while they're moist. We want them dry, but leave the roots on there. Don't cut them off. Don't remove the tunicate, that layer on the outside of the bulb. Leave that on there, and leave green leaves on the plant.
All right. Here's how about dividing crinum clusters?
Have a backhoe.
Yeah.
Crinum is a large Amaryllis family member that can produce bulbs the size of grapefruit or even bowling ball size. I've seen as well. It is you can dig and divide that anytime throughout the year, but similar to the Hymenocallus that I showed you, if we have a hard freeze and that foliage has just melted down, it looks like it went through a microwave. From that point into spring is probably our best chance to dig that, to take advantage of the fact that it's going dormant, and we'll be able to get in there. But one thing to note is that you have to have the right tools, heavy duty shovels, strong handled shovels, to get down and remove the whole plant, and then cut the bulbs apart without breaking those stems or severing the leaf mount of the bulb from those basal plates. So it's very tricky. Prepare for quite a bit of a workout when you're dividing crinums. I'll do this one on daylilies real quick. It just says advice on daylilies. So my advice on daylilies is be very cautious when you plant a daylily, because you'll end up within 2 or 3 years, you'll have a whole garden bed filled with them. But it's one, I brought a whole bunch of them with me. I mean, this big cluster right here, I dug up with the spade shovel, and once I dig that and I shake the soil loose from it, a lot of times what happens is that the individual offsets will just separate naturally. You don't really have to do any cutting on those. Just grab it. If it looks like there's two obvious halves, just start kind of vibrating them away from each other, and then they'll just separate out. And then now you've got 2 clusters or 3 clusters from that one little bunch. But again, these are ones that if you've got good moisture in the soil, a lot of organic matter, they can become pretty weedy on you, and you might end up being the person who's constantly giving daylilies away to the point where they shut the garage door and they close the mini blinds when they see you coming over, because you don't want any more daylilies. Same thing with the Louisiana iris, canna, etc. Plants that continually to vigorously propagate themselves, they can become weedy. And so just keep that in mind when you're putting them in a particular space in the landscape. A good example here with this is that I had a big cluster of them at the house where I dug this from, and when I extracted this one cluster, I found a cluster of some small jonquils that were underneath them that I'd been looking for 3 or 4 years, and kind of forgot where I put them. But basically, the daylily just grew right over the top of them, and so now I've got my little jonquils back. So I'll move them somewhere further away from the daylilies going into the future. Any questions on hand, Paul?
Yes, sir. Here's one from Joe. If you split an amaryllis bulb, do you replant it back in the ground? So I'm assuming you were off a little bit with the spade and you split it. Can you replant it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this a lot of times this is kind of what you'll see, and this is one that I just beat up here. It's got the basal plate on it, but when I was digging that with the spade, just say I hit it and I cut one side open and you have this milky white latex sap, I would leave this out of the ground for a couple days in the sunshine or in a dry area and let this callus over. You'll get to a point where it's dry and it's not really a scab, but it's just hard on there and seals up before you replant that. I wouldn't go and then directly plant that back into the soil immediately if you've end up damaging it. Um, if you do a great job with these and we don't damage it, let's see. So a lot of them, when we dig them up, we're going to see a big cluster of bulbs together. And sometimes the basal plate will still be connected just a little bit. And it just takes just a little bit of pressure and just kind of pull that apart. And if you crack at the basal plate only, if that's the only part that cracks when you separate it, then that's perfectly fine to go ahead and plant that back in the ground. But if you end up damaging the bulb where you can see that white leaf tissue and it's starting to sap out on you, if it's a sticky white latex, leave that out of the ground for a couple days, let it heal up, and then put it back into the soil.
All right. Barbara wants to know if you can talk about the amount of sun needed by most bulbs.
That's a good question. And for us, it's going to be full sun for nearly everything. Some plants can be a little forgiving at times. They may be actually preferred of shade of southwest sun. Okay, so if you can orient your landscape, look at that one corner there that's on the southwest side of the house that gets direct sun in midsummer, late summer. That might be the one area to try to stay away from. But beyond that one point, these bulbs need full sun. So this is going to be 6-8 hours of direct sun. As we take that away and we get below 6 hours, 5 hours, 4 hours of direct sun, we would expect to see more foliage, taller foliage, because the plants are having to reach up higher to get to the sun, to have more solar panels, you might say, as far as leaf growth. But all that is at expense of floral development, spending more energy trying to create more green growth, and then it may not have enough to produce reproductive bodies in the form of flower stems.
Okay.
So as we see these, older clusters that are, where there's trees or shrubs that have grown over them, the plants won't die, but they won't produce the amount of floral habit that we would really like them to have.
All right. And I think the explanation you just gave answered Suma's question, because Suma asked, my spider lilies seem to be growing vigorously now. Will they bloom now? And so basically they're in a vegetative state, and they're as you mentioned, they're building up those solar panels to get them through.
Right. Well, and that you might have her explain, are we talking about Lycoris or are we talking about Crinums or Hymenocallus? This is a short lesson here in common names of plants, that those three plants are going to have a different habit. So if she can explain what spider lily she's talking about, I can go deeper into that question. Let me talk about tools real quick, okay? Being a bulb collector for years and being tempted to get out on the side of the highway and dig up a little cluster of something that I saw growing in a ditch. I broke a lot of shovels. I broke a lot of hand tools. And so One thing that I would recommend here, this is a camp shovel. My father-in-law gave me this a long time ago. It's got a very short, very thick hardwood handle, very thick bracket here, very thick metal head to it, and it's got a foot plate on here and a really sharp razor tip to this thing. I could keep this in my truck to protect myself from carjackers if I needed it. But this has never let me down when I needed to dig up a small cluster of bulbs somewhere or just doing some yard work of moving some plants around. Short handle means that I can dig around the plant and I can leverage this out without a longer handle that when I start putting pressure, I'm going to get a break point along the um, handle somewhere. So keep that in mind. Either a very thick, strong wood handle, or you see some of the composite handles on some of the sharpshooter shovels that won't be so prone to breakage. But heavy tip, sharp edge on here, and a very durable shovel is a fantastic tool. And then when we get into just nitpicking bulbs, if I just want to take a couple out of a cluster, our hoary garden knives are very important here. And there's lots of these available. The thicker the blade, the better on this one here. This is an A.M. Leonard. Got a good strong handle because, we have to dig around the bulb, try to dig underneath the roots, and then we're prying these up. And so if you don't have enough strength on the tool, just regular garden trowels, forget about it. You're going to break them all day long. Okay, but these right here are thick. The blade goes all the way to the back. So when I put pressure and I leverage this, it's coming out of the ground. Okay, and also most of them, they have a sharp edge and a serrated edge. So if you get into some tree roots, a lot of times when we're digging bulbs, there'll be some tree roots or some vine roots or vine stems in there. And so this actually is a good way to cut through those roots and stems so that we can access around the plants and to extract them. Another one here, if we have smaller bulbs that we're trying to dig up here, this is just a narrow, hard-handled trowel, narrow-headed trowel. And so with this one, I can really kind of dig down in there where I want to and use this heavy, long, pointed tip to really kind of pry the smaller bulbs out of the ground. Some of the smaller rain lilies, copper lilies, etc. It's a pretty good choice for you. But the main variable there is durable, heavy duty, strong metal, strong handles, because we're using a lot of leverage in these things, and they can break. One last thing I want to go through real quick is just some products. Always questions that I get. These are the first questions. Okay, are these two things here? They said when I plant bulbs, I put the bone meal and the blood meal, and when you go to the garden centers, they always have these two things right next to the bulbs. And I took these from my wife because she actually uses these for varmint control, for rabbit control in her flower field, but I don't use these for bulbs because as gardeners, we're already focusing on soil health and quality with appropriate fertilization and the adding of organic matter. So most of our soils should be nutrient rich. Okay, so if we have a good, balanced, healthy soil, we could say we don't need these things. Okay, now what blood meal is basically it's a source of nitrogen. Okay, but if you're fertilizing the flower beds and you've got organic matter in the soil, probably have a pretty good amount of nitrogen, so don't really need that. Bone meal is giving us a source of phosphorus for the plants, and again, our soils here tend to be very high in phosphorus, particularly our clay soils. So we could argue that they have plenty of phosphorus to get the job done. But when in doubt, soil sampling is always very important. Uh, Dig a soil sample from your flower beds every 2 or 3 years just to see how balanced your soil nutrition is, and then adjust it based off of the soil sample. Don't start throwing stuff in the hole because the garden center told you to. Okay. Other one is going to be care products. I tried digging up as much of this stuff as I could. If we're digging bulbs and dividing them and putting them back in the ground, um, I like to put a little protection on them that's going to discourage disease pressure or insect pressure during the reestablishment process. Okay, so a couple products that I'm going to recommend. One is what I've got right here is sulfur. This is a dusting or a powder sulfur, and the sulfur acts as a insect repellent and a fungicide as well. So just that one product would be sufficient in a lot of situations, is just to put those bulbs into a basket, lightly dust over the top with some powdered sulfur, shake it up till you get a little coverage on there, and then go plant those in the ground with that coating on there. Some other products that I like to use, one is horticultural diatomaceous earth. So the same thing with it is just a little dusting with diatomaceous earth, and that is going to minimize pressure from root feeding insects like grubs, earwigs, etc. This is made out of these small prehistoric diatoms, this little chitin that cuts the insects as they're trying to dig around the bulbs and feed on them. Another one is going to be a pyrethrin dust, and pyrethrin is a organic derivative of a chrysanthemum, and so we can dust the bulbs with a little pyrethrin dust to keep root and bulb feeding soil-borne insects from feeding on the bulbs. And then a spinosad-based powder or dust. Spinosad is another natural derivative. It's a combination of these spinosins that have good insect control qualities. So everything that I've mentioned so far could potentially be certified organic, depending on the product. So easy on the environment, easy on us. But this offers a little bit of protection for those bulbs until they get reestablished in the ground. When we put them in the ground, they have to go through a process of redeveloping, growing root tips into the soil, establishing a new tunic development on there, which is kind of its safety jacket. So during that process, and then maybe if we've cut the bulb accidentally and we've got some exposed tissue in there, a little bit of a protective layer for insect and disease control is always a good idea. Well, that's all I have today, Paul. Do we have any other questions on the list?
We got one last question, and it's
Okay.
from Chevy. And her question is, problem with squirrels digging the bulbs out or taking a bite. What can I do?
Well, we can stop the recording and I'll give you some options. Uh, or we think about bulbs. The Amaryllis that I mentioned, the family of plants that Amaryllis is called the Amaryllidaceae. Okay, and every plant within this family produces these toxic alkaloids within the plant. It's not going to kill us for messing with them, but if we ate any one of those, we would get a pretty bad stomach ache, and we would not want to eat another one of those plants again. And so it's the same thing with varmin. If you're planting jonquils, daffodils, oxblood lilies, spider lilies, all the different types of spider lilies, amaryllis, hippeastrum, everything that's in this family, we shouldn't have a whole lot of problem with any type of animal repeatedly digging them and eating them. Sometimes what animals are doing is trying to get to earthworms or grubs that may be feeding underneath the bulbs or on the root system, and they'll dislodge the bulb to try to get at the food that they're looking for. And so in those cases, there's not much we can do there besides just pop those bulbs back in the ground. But when we get into plants like Gladiolus, which is a corm in the iris family, and then the lily family, which is going to be our onions, multiplying onions, ornamental alliums, our tulips, etc. These can be eaten by wildlife, including squirrels, and you just have to be careful with those. You can buy these little wire cages, or you can just some people will take just a little ball of chicken wire, and when you're planting those clusters, is just put that over the top of it. The foliage will grow right through it, but it allows a little barrier for protection of those bulbs. There are some animal repellents that are available on the market. They're questionable whether how well or consistently they're going to provide impact for you. So with some bulbs, that's just a reality that we have to deal with. But if you stick with bulbs in the Amaryllis family, the Amaryllidaceae, which is a large library of bulbs, and most of the ones that I grow personally are in this family, you shouldn't have really any significant impacts from animals.
All right. Gene had a question about when you showed the blood meal and I guess the bone meal on varmint control. I guess she hasn't heard that before. So how does your wife use it, or what are you repelling with it out in those cut flower fields?
Yeah, rabbits and deer.
Okay.
This is a way that it kind of cues them off that something's not right when they get the scent of blood or bone in the area, that they don't kind of make themselves at home. It's a constant effort and a lot of strategies for people that have deer or rabbit problems in gardens. And that's one out of many different types of options out there. This is just a repeated dusting of the foliage or the surface of the ground around where you have plants that are prime picks for foliage eating animals.
Okay. Catherine wants to know when is the best time to plant daffodils?
It's going to be a couple months ago.
Okay.
And I would say anywhere from September all the way through November, because for us, a lot of the narcissus, which are your daffodils, jonquils, paperwhites, etc., they're coming out of dormancy now, and they tend to max out in late February is when we tend to have our daffodil show here in our part of the country. So if you planted them now, the plant has to get established and grow roots and then have enough energy and root development to come up and produce flowers for you. So really not the best time if we want to show this year. You can plant them basically anytime, but if we had bulbs that we're purchasing and we want those to flower this coming spring, they needed to be planted September, October, November.
Okay, and I think that will tie in. Rathna wanted to know where is a good place to get these bulbs now, since I missed the bulb sale.
Yeah, good question. Well, I mentioned all the catalogs that you'll find, and for all the generic nationwide catalogs, it's buyer beware of the plant material that they're offering. The one thing that I'll say is that there's several catalogs. One is Southern Bulbs, and this is a Texas company. And then there's Old House Gardens, which is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the good thing I like about both of these companies and catalogs is that they only sell bulbs that are appropriate to be planted at certain times of the year. within those time frames. And so if you look at the catalog for Old House Gardens now, they're not selling daffodils and narcissus. They're selling summer bulbs, bulbs that need to be planted in late winter and spring that are going to flower in the summer and maybe into fall. And then as we get towards the end of summer, they'll open up their catalog for the fall planted bulbs that will bloom again for us in spring. So those are really the two active catalogs and companies that I would recommend. I'd like to do one big shout out for, I know there's a lot of bulb sales across the state, but the Smith County Master Gardeners by far has the best program on bulbs, because they do a whole lot of work to be able to provide hardy bulbs. And these include heirlooms, but they're not limited to heirlooms. These are bulbs that they've trialed and had success with, that grow well for us and will perennialize in our gardens. And so if you haven't studied up on that one, just search for Smith County, which is Tyler, Texas, Master Gardener Association, and see when they're hosting their next sale.
All right, we got two left, Boone. So let's get through these. Shaku asked, "Do jonquils do well in our area like rain lilies? I always thought daffodils do well only in the north."
Mm-hmm. Well, so we have a lot of different classifications. There's a lot of different species of narcissus, which jonquils, daffodils, etc., are all within. And so typically we would say the large flowered daffodils, which would be our, Easter yellow big trumpet thing. There's just not a whole lot of cultivars of those that do well for us because of our weather and our lack of winter chill. Most of those cultivars need more winter cooling, longer cool period, to be able to come up in spring and produce a reliable bloom for us. Now, say that some of the smaller jonquils, which you would, if you went towards Louisiana, you would see some of these native stands or established stands of common jonquils, or what they call sweeties, or Campanelle jonquil. There are several there that are hardy, that do bloom for us very well, and that will propagate and reproduce for us pretty quickly. And if you go, I'll use the Old House Gardens catalog and website, for example, is they'll list for each particular plant, it'll have the zone range for those plants. And so for us, we are 9A, 9B, depending on who you talk to each year. So we would use that as a reference to choose those jonquils or daffodils that are going to say 9A, 9B, or 10A. Anything above that, if we get into 8s, 8A, and even 8B, there's probably not going to be reliable choices for us.
All right. And our last question for today, Boone, is from Suma. And she said, "I got some bulbs last year and put them in the fridge since she couldn't plant them on time. But she did plant them this year. Any chance of survival?"
Yeah, it's just like seeds, Suma. Some seeds, if you keep them refrigerated appropriately and they're dry, they'll last for a couple of years, but our germination rate is going to continually diminish each year that we keep those. So it's the same thing with bulbs. Even if we treated them perfectly, the amount of vigor in those bulbs, even if they're frozen or underneath a bed in a dry, dark situation, they are oxidizing. And so it's kind of like a piece of meat. The longer you keep a piece of red meat in the freezer, the quality is still going to diminish because it is oxidizing. So it's really the same concept with plants, that I put them in the ground and give all the pampering that you can to get them up and going, but just know that that the result may not be the quality that you were expecting from the first year.
All right. Well, Boone, I think we've got it covered. I want to thank you. You did an excellent job answering these questions and providing some live visuals today. So everything looked great. I want to thank our audience for participating, posting those questions, and we will be back next week. We've got one more for this year. Stephen Brugerhoff from Brazoria County will be covering plant myths and mystics, which should be an interesting topic. So until then, I hope you all have a good day, and thank you for joining us.
No pun intended, but happy holidays. See you, Paul. Y'all take care.
All right, Boone. Good job.